going to give a few minutes so that I, did I just mute? That I can let everyone in. All right, I'm just admitting everyone to the room. And then I'll begin. I'm trying to multitask. Sarah, do you want me to keep you pinned, or would you want, is that good?
It's fine with me. Yep.
Okay.
I don't know if everything is going to get moved around anyway when I actually start sharing my PowerPoint, so don't know exactly what will happen. Just sharing that as a heads up.
Sure. I'll remove it for now, and then we can always, when you start presenting, I can put it back on and see how it goes. Just 1 or 2 more minutes, because I know we had a ton of registrants, and then I will begin with my little spiel.
That's due tomorrow or?
Hello?
One more minute, and then I will begin, so I don't keep you all waiting. Okay. Well, thank you all so much for being here this evening. I'm Ariel Morris, and I'm the Family Resource Specialist for Early Hearing Detection and Intervention with Parent Information Center of Delaware. I support families with children and youth who are diagnosed with hearing loss. So before I give Sarah the floor, I just wanted to mention that a survey is going to be emailed out to our attendees after this learning community is over. So if you have a moment to fill it out, I would appreciate it. We have 2 ASL interpreters tonight, Sarah Campbell and Rachel McGarry. And Sarah Campbell is going to be the first one to start to interpret. So if you need to pin her, please do. And we also have closed captioning available as well, if you should need that. We are going to be taking questions after the presentation's over. So you can feel free to raise your hand to be called on, or you can put questions into the chat and then I can read that off to you. To Sarah, I'm sorry. Okay, and so Sarah, I'm so excited to have you here with us tonight. She is a deaf writer, a parent of a deaf hard of hearing child, and author of the New York Times bestselling novel True Biz. She has an MFA from Columbia University and is a college instructor of deaf studies and creative writing. And she lives with her family outside of Philadelphia. And now I give you Sarah.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me this evening. So very much looking forward to chatting with you and sharing some information with you. I'll go ahead and dive right in. We certainly have plenty of time in our night this evening, and we'll be able to have some time for discussion at the end. I'm going to go ahead and share my PowerPoint now. And then I'll give everyone a second to rearrange their screens as need be, because I'm certain that things will move around, and then we'll get started. Okay, is everyone able to see the PowerPoint clearly? All right. So the goal of this evening is to cover a few common myths or misconceptions in regards to American Sign Language and bilingualism and deaf education. These are a few of the myths that I see come up again and again. And I wanted to take a moment to share each of these myths with you and then talk a little bit about why that myth is actually a misconception and not true at all. I wanted to open with giving you an idea or a tool, piece of equipment, let's say, that you can use in your everyday life. This is a way for you to figure out if something actually is a myth about American Sign Language or not. I typically use this with my students, this tool. I say, does the idea pass the French test? The French test is basically that if you have an idea about American Sign Language, you should think to yourself, could I say this same thing about the French language? So for example, is American Sign Language a universal language? Many people think that ASL is a universal language and that deaf people around the globe all use the same signed language. But if we take that idea and we say the same thing about French, is French a universal language? Obviously, we know that doesn't make any sense at all. And so that tells us it's likely not true about American Sign Language. So that's a very simple kind of test that you can do. And you can do the same thing for English. Okay. Let's start with our first myth. This is probably the most common question that I get or people ask. If I sign with my deaf or hard of hearing child, does that mean that they will have a delay in acquiring spoken language skills? Oftentimes people think that if they teach a deaf or hard of hearing child American Sign Language, that they will become confused because they're trying to learn two languages at the same time, two different languages at the same time, or think that they will pick up American Sign Language faster because it's quote unquote easier, and that they won't want to pick up spoken language later. Now, that's a myth. American Sign Language does not, or the acquisition of American Sign Language does not delay the acquisition of speech. ASL is a full and complete language, It has all of the same benefits that we correlate with other languages as we learn bilingually. They benefit our brain, and ASL has all of those same benefits. Language development in deaf and hard of hearing children and in hearing children benefits from the use of early American Sign Language exposure. Our human brains are ready for language before the physical anatomy of the body is able to produce vocalizations. So that's for everyone, not just deaf or hard of hearing children. We are seeing more and more evidence, data, research, and studies that show the specific benefits of American Sign Language use for children who have cochlear implants as well. We'll talk about 2 or 3 studies tonight that specifically say that children who have cochlear implants and also have exposure to American Sign Language, their assessments in spoken languages and academic skills are better than the children who have cochlear implants alone. So those are 2 areas that show us that it is critically important that we can make improvements through American Sign Language of phonological awareness and memory. And that's really cool because signed language is not related to sound, but even still, it can support those sound and memorization skills. It's pretty neat. Something else that we've seen in some new studies is the improvement of expressive grammar skills. We see that that is stronger in children who have both American Sign Language and a cochlear implant and access to both. One of the biggest reasons I think people become concerned about this particular myth parents are given a list of these particular milestones or goals that our children should be hitting. At 18 months old, your baby should do A, B, C, and D, whatever it is, and what specific number of words they should know. But if a baby is using American Sign Language and is able to produce a sign, that sign actually counts as a word spoken. And if the baby is able to say something and is also able to sign the same word, that actually counts as 2 words. So they have doubles their language, not delays it. Another question that people have is they often think as hearing parents of deaf or hard of hearing children, they wonder if they're still able to make a difference in their child's life and their language development if they aren't able to fluently sign American Sign Language themselves, if they're still learning or they sign minimally. Fortunately, we have a lot of information about this particular issue and the fact that hearing parents can make a huge difference in their child's language acquisition and early life, especially. 2 studies that I will share here. One of those tells us that those students who have exposure to American Sign Language before 6 months of age, so this is a very young baby, and this is a young baby who has hearing parents. When they were tested from that age, 6 months up through the age of 5 years, they were able to maintain age-appropriate language and vocabulary development. So they had that same level of vocabulary as their hearing peers and hit that expected milestone. The second study basically tells us the exact same thing, but it's just starting at 8 months and continuing to 5 years old. That study also looked at older children as well. Those children who were not having sign language given to them in their families until later. And what was really interesting is that the vocabulary size was small. The amount of vocabulary words that they knew was small, but their receptive skills continued to be strong. So they were able to acquire and catch up with their language quickly because they were seeing it not only at school, but at home as well. So again, these are two very important things to keep in mind. Number one, you do not have to be completely proficient in American Sign Language for that to be beneficial to your deaf or hard of hearing child. You can be learning in tandem with them. And you can still provide support for their language growth. The second key point here is, even if you didn't start right away using ASL with your child, you can still make a difference. You can add American Sign Language into your family. You can learn together, and that will improve your child's vocabulary acquisition. So a critical point there. Again, we've obviously discussed language acquisition and how critical it is for deaf and hard of hearing children. So signing within the family is incredibly important for emotional relationships and development as well. You're showing your child that you are willing to share the work of communicating with one another. That it's not only the job of the deaf or hard of hearing person or child in the family to try to figure out communication with their hearing family, but that as a whole family, you're working together to communicate with one another, and that builds a strong emotional bond. Before I jump to our next myth, I wanted to take a moment to talk a little bit about what we call language deprivation. It's a vocabulary word. I'll give a little explanation. I'm sure most of you are already familiar with this, but if you are not, we'll just review a little bit. Language deprivation happens if the brain does not acquire a fluent first language within what we call the critical window for language acquisition. That's approximately
Hello, good morning.
to age 5. And everyone is a little bit different, but pretty much birth to age 5. Now, if the child doesn't have at least one language by the age of 5, they can experience language deprivation. And that makes it incredibly challenging for them to acquire language in the future. And this also can have permanent cognitive effects on the brain, on the memory, on executive function, and on social emotional learning, which can be incredibly frustrating because the child is not able to understand or communicate their lack of understanding, and it comes through in other ways. The issue with language deprivation is not the same as that of a language delay. It's not about trying to catch up, because what happens with language deprivation is once you've passed that critical window period and that window has closed, the option for catching up is incredibly challenging and requires a
Back to
tremendous
class,
amount of
please.
work.
See you later.
But we can avoid 100% of the time language deprivation with our deaf and hard of hearing children because we are able to utilize American Sign Language with them to communicate with them and provide a language foundation for our deaf and hard of hearing children. And from that point on, they would be able to acquire additional languages moving forward because our brains have the ability to understand and operate and utilize language through patterning. So it's not through sound. Language is based on patterns. So any first language, whether that's a spoken language or signed language, sets the foundation. And then we can utilize that foundation and apply it to the acquisition of other languages moving forward. Okay. So here's another myth, and this is a big one. The myth is that kids who have cochlear implants don't need American Sign Language. The data that we have, the numbers and statistics, show us something different. Right now in the United States, approximately 70% of deaf or hard of hearing children who have a cochlear implant do not develop age expected language. And again, this is for children from ages birth to 8. So during that time, we're seeing that 70% of children who have cochlear implants are not meeting their age expectations in terms of language milestones. Some are able to meet those milestones, and that's wonderful. But most are not. We see a lot of variables with the effectiveness of cochlear implants, and they work differently for different individuals. They also work differently in different environments as well. So this study from 2018 showed that more than 50% of kids with cochlear implants were hearing about 80% of words in quiet environments, and they were missing about 20% of words in quiet environments. But in noisy environments, 93% of those children that participated in this study missed all of the words in a noisy environment. So that is a huge difference between a quiet environment and a noisy environment. And that means that we are taking a lot of risk if we have a deaf or hard of hearing child in a classroom. A classroom setting is generally fairly noisy. And if we're using only a cochlear implant to provide access for them as opposed to using a visual language, we're really taking some risks. Again, we also see from another study that kids that have cochlear implants and American Sign Language do better with their academic skills and also with their spoken language skills. So again, a lot depends on the individual child or person. A lot depends on the environment, the listening environment. But ASL is the only language that we have 100% accessibility with 100% of the time for people who are deaf and hard of hearing. And that's true not only for kids with cochlear implants, it's true for any child who is deaf or hard of hearing, or any person who is deaf or hard of hearing. People who are deaf and hard of hearing, and I want to emphasize that my son is deaf, hard of hearing, and he has hearing aids. And oftentimes people will say, oh, he has hearing aids, so that means he can hear. But those hearing aids don't give him 100% access. The only thing that gives him 100% access is American Sign Language. And as his mom, I want him to have access to spoken language, of course, but I also want him to have 100% access to language at all times, especially in his classrooms. I want both for him. I'm his mom.
Okay. So I want to talk next a little bit about how we kind of how we represent the oral only approach. The oral only approach to language itself and in its assimilation into society at large. Many times when people are using the oral only approach to education, it's related to technology. People assume that that is a direct link to data and science and STEM and things of that nature. But the real foundation for the idea of oralism is pretty old. It's from the 19th century. And it's not really linked to pedagogy in the way that we approach that language today. It's more of that approach is on the values of assimilation. You can read this quote for yourself if you would like, or you can skip down to the Alexander Graham Bell quote itself. That was the goal for deaf education in the late 19th century. It was to assimilate. Why? Because America was truly going through a period where a lot of immigrants were coming into the country, and there was truly a fear of someone being different. And at the same time, we're basing our educational system on people from other countries coming into our country. So they were really trying to decide how to set up education for all these different people coming in. And some people felt very strongly that for the educational system, truly it needed to focus on English. And that linked and then influenced deaf education in the system it is and shaped it from that time on. Then the way we see the spoken language and the oralism approach now. So we have LSA and ABT are both private certifications sold by organizations. They're not degrees from school. They're private organizations that set up their own certifications. Typically, you'll see they're only studying groups that are made up of very small groups, and the structure is very listening-oriented environment. The students are typically not doing well on the listening spoken language only environment. And often they'll say, well, these students might have other disabilities, or they have an auditory processing disorder. So it's not really something that can be directly applied and implicated to a wide range of students and people. For some people that are very successful in this, that's fine. For some people and students, it can be a high-risk environment. Both deaf and hearing people, everyone benefits from visual materials in a learning environment. And hearing people can lip read as well. So it's important to think about what you're setting up as a learning environment for students if you're trying then to educate them to speak only. And we're trying to teach deaf people to speak again. I think that's fine. I'm saying nothing against being able to give them the ability to speak, but give them that support that's needed through visual access, through speech, through cued speech, through other sign language skills, as well as the technology. The American Association of Pediatrics, the AAP now, they've changed their position on this last year. So I've seen that will say it's okay to use both spoken language and speech therapy as well as American Sign Language at the same time. They're saying that now. Before, the idea was you need to choose one modality only and pick that and go with it, but now they're saying, okay, you can have both. And that's good. You can have both. One thing that does come up often, and I do see this, is the visual takeover theory. So we'll go into what that is. The visual takeover theory is the idea that if a deaf person is seeing American Sign Language and using American Sign Language, their brain will kind of redisposition that area of the thought of the brain for auditory processing and kind of reallocate it to visual processing. This idea comes from a study that occurred in 1991, where they saw deaf people who were using sign language and viewing and understanding sign language visually, and a certain area of their brain that lit up while looking at sign language was typically on the area of a brain, typically that a hearing person would use to process auditory language. So that's kind of the cool thing about the brain, right? Our brain can reallocate if an area of your brain is not being used. But today this isn't really happening because deaf children are given access to sound from very early on through hearing aids and through CIs. So the brain will not reallocate that portion that it's still being used for auditory processing. So it's not really a concern now. Another thing that pops up is with things related to this theory is something called auditory deprivation, language deprivation, things of that nature. Some people are confusing the idea of auditory deprivation with language deprivation. And these are different. So again, most kids today have access between hearing aids and cochlear implants, have some access to sound. So auditory deprivation is not happening in general. But if someone is living without access to sound, their brain is still fine 100% of the time. It's working if they still have language. If someone does not have access to any language, that can then affect and damage other parts of the brain. So these are different approaches, different mindsets. Another thing pops up in this discussion typically. I'm not labeling this a myth because this can be an important discussion, but something that often it comes up and is said during discussions like this is people will say the doctor says I have to get a cochlear implant, and if I don't, as soon as possible, it won't work. It's better to do this earlier, they're telling me. Now, we have seen some evidence to support the idea of early implementation that has better results. Because our brains are really plastic at that point, that neuroplasticity for young babies is very real. So it's easier for younger children to learn everything between language and sound processing, everything at the same time. That can be true. If that's an important part of the session and the family makes that decision. But I want to counter that there is no evidence supporting that withholding sign language is beneficial. So the most important thing is always to remember. One important thing to remember from all of tonight is that you can have both. You can have both, if your family really wants to have children that do sign language as well as spoken language, you can have both. The idea that we have to pick one modality only for our children, that's the myth. That's what's false. American Sign Language and English can work together for your deaf and hard of hearing children. and for everyone, really. Another thing I see often that comes up in this discussion is when we're talking about American Sign Language and education. Bilingual education comes up. Sometimes people set up different things. The kids will learn spoken English in the mainstream school system. And at the School for the Deaf, that's an ASL only environment, and that's the only access they'll get to in that education. But that's really a big misunderstanding, I believe. There are bilingual approaches in deaf schools that will allow children to acquire both sign language and reading and writing and spoken language. I'll give you an example from my own child, my own son. He goes to a school for the deaf, and they're in a bilingual program. And that means for him, and every school can look a little different, but for his class, and he's 6, there is a deaf teacher and there is a hearing teacher, and they work together. One does the ASL and one does the English. And they use both back and forth all day long throughout the day. If my son wants to choose to speak at some point, he can. If my son wants to choose to sign only at one point, he can, because both teachers are there to support him and allow him to code switch or whatever he wants to do at that particular moment. At the same time, he has speech therapy 3 times a week with a speech therapist who knows American Sign Language as well. And every day I meet the audiologist who checks the hearing aids to make sure everything is functioning well and that he has access to sound and everything looks good. So that environment for him is really great. It's a place where I feel he has access to both the spoken language and sign language. And this year I've seen his spoken language really take off and develop quite well without any suppression of his sign language and any pressure on him. So that's really cool to see. And it's exciting to see him really acquiring both languages quite well. He's a child that experienced language deprivation in his own past. He grew up where in Southeast Asia in an orphanage. He had limited access to any language at that point until about the age of 4. So having this method for him to acquire whatever language he feels like communicating with in that moment is important. And that's been a big change for him compared to how he used to grow up, being so frustrated, and now to have understand language and understand that frustration can be alleviated through communication. To be able to just communicate easily with whatever he wants is important. So that's our experience in our family.
There are some resources if you're interested in starting to learn sign language and you haven't done so yet. These are some places that you would be able to take classes potentially online or in person in Pennsylvania and New Jersey and Delaware, of course. Delaware also provides a deaf mentor program for families who have children who are deaf and hard of hearing from ages birth through 5. And I bring that up because when kids are able to see deaf adults who are like them, it's incredibly powerful. It's powerful to have that connection and to have someone to look up to. It's also the best way to learn sign language is from a deaf person. So again, I'm sure that you already have access to most of these resources on this list, but they're here again in case you need them. So I also have a newsletter. Tomorrow I will be posting all of the links to the studies that I've referenced this evening. If you want to take a look through any of those, you certainly can, and take a look at all of those different studies. It's easier to access them via a link instead of me trying to put that information here. I'd love to have more conversation. We can talk about my experiences, my son's experiences, really anything that you'd like to speak about. Now is the time to do it. I'm open to questions.
Thank you, Sarah. That was great. We really appreciate your presentation. You know, does anybody have questions for Sarah? You can unmute or you can put them into the chat and I can read them off.
I have a question, and I don't know if it's for Sarah or more for the Delaware folks on here, but so my daughter is in the early learning program, which is definitely bilingual at Delaware School for the Deaf. My understanding is once you hit kindergarten, it tends to be much more ASL focused, so that the kids that need more sign might choose that route, and mainstream kids might be the ones that tend to do more spoken language. I get the sense that the latter is what my daughter would prefer, but I don't want her to lose all the ASL that she's learning, while she's in the early learning program. So, like, are there any suggestions on ways for kids that aren't ingrained in school every day, kind of how to keep them learning ASL with kids their age or anything like that?
Maybe the Delaware folks can answer this. I do have some links that I can add where you would be able to join various groups of children virtually to continue signing with, maybe have some groups of friends that are around the same age. Typically, they will play games with a deaf mentor and maybe have 2, 3, 4 games that they do with a group of deaf kids with a deaf mentor. And maybe that can also be something that's done in person. I'm not sure if anyone from Delaware is able to answer that question, but I will find the link for that to share as well. This is Mindy. I don't know if anyone can see me or not. Hi, my name is Mindy. I am the statewide program director for deaf and hard of hearing and deaf-blind children in the state of Delaware. And yes, that is definitely a challenge. But at the same time, one of the cool things is we are making some improvements in sending out communications, emails of all events that are happening across the state of Delaware. So if your daughter attends a mainstream program, continue to look at those emails to see where there are events where deaf individuals are coming together. That might happen through Hands and Voices. It could be an event through statewide programs. And also there are some school districts that are also talking about hosting various events across school districts where individuals or who are deaf or hard of hearing or children who are deaf and hard of hearing can come together. So hopefully we'll be having more resources like that available in the future here in the state of Delaware.
Thank you, Mindy.
Sure.
See what the chat says. There is one recommended having conversations between friends and family can also help continue to use the language. other questions or comments?
I'm going to go ahead and drop the link in the chat for that program I was just talking about. It's called Friends Like Me. And again, you can just sign up for that, and then they will match you with a group of children that are around the same age and have the same type of communication preferences and styles. They have some for kids who use ASL, some for kids who use English or spoken language, and some for who use both or use a total communication approach.
Thank you. And Sarah, you mentioned you are open to talking about your situation with your son. So how do you notice a preference for language, or how do you work that in your home situation? And do you find that interesting, whether he's acquiring one more versus the other, or what that's like?
This is Sarah. So yes, I'm completely fascinated. I'm definitely a language nerd. And so it's beautiful and so cool to see this all happen in real time with my son. Actually, both my sons are bilingual. I actually have a hearing son as well. He's a CODA, child of deaf adults, and ASL was his first language. So it's interesting to watch that happen in a different way. But yes, when my son first arrived, he had really no language at all. And right away, he was, just glommed onto ASL and picked that up very, very quickly. But now he has his hearing aids, and he really does jump back and forth between languages all throughout the day. It really depends upon a lot of variables. If he understands the person that he's communicating with most of the time, he will use whatever language works best with them. Also, he's 6, right? So depends on his mood. Sometimes if he's just not feeling like talking or not feeling like signing. But I do still notice that there are times, particularly if there's something that's a bit more abstract of an idea, or if there's a feeling that he's trying to share, that he will often go back to American Sign Language. Even if he has been using spoken language in that conversation, if something hard or abstract needs to happen, he will switch to ASL. So for him, you can absolutely see that that's probably the way his brain processes information, is in American Sign Language, but he loves to talk. And so he really loves to hear his own voice. I remember when he got his hearing aids, he kept screaming and yelling and saying things because he likes to hear his own voice. And he still loves to hear his own voice. So we really utilize both. He utilizes both, and it's awesome to see. And we just follow his lead.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I found everything very interesting. I'm a parent of a deaf child, and I'm one of those who was told that, if she wants to have spoken language, it should just be spoken language when she was young. So it's very interesting to hear the information that is being given now. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I'm so excited that this generation of parents has more access to this kind of information. Just to even from mainstream media, television, everything, and the American Association of Pediatrics, that was huge when they made that shift. And ASHA has also made some changes as well for the speech language pathologists. It's slow, but it's coming along. Those changes are happening. So I just saw a question pop up in the chat that said, when should you add captions to the television? Now, right now, you should add them. I mean, honestly, just put them on and leave them on all the time. My first son, who is the Coda, my oldest son, I mean, really, I think a lot of his awareness of reading and he's 4, I'm sorry. So he's 4, he's not my oldest. He doesn't read fully, obviously, yet. He's only 4, but he is definitely able to recognize some words at this point. And I really believe that that's in large part from the fact that we, number one, read to him a lot, but also that we always have the captions on our television, and he's able to pair what he sees on the screen with what he hears.
There's another question, Sarah. What advice do you have for parents who feel too intimidated by the task of learning ASL and they avoid the thought of sending their child to a deaf school?
So there's 2 parts to that. Let me say, I think that it is incredibly normal to feel overwhelmed at the task of learning an entirely new language. It's not easy. It's a challenge. It's hard to learn a whole new language, especially here in America, where we have this idea that, that we should only be utilizing one language here, that we only need one, that we don't have to utilize other languages. That's very different than it is in other countries or other places around the world. But yes, first, it's normal to feel overwhelmed. Let's start with that. And then the second thing that I would say is, as parents, we do hard things all the time, literally all day, every day. And this is just another one of those things. And this particular thing is actually going to make all of the other hard things a lot easier in the long run. Because when you have the ability to communicate with your child, when those communication barriers are overcome, that absolutely makes everything else that you need to do with your child that much easier. And again, like we mentioned before, you don't have to be fully fluent in the language. We can learn in tandem with our children. Learn a few signs every day. Take 1 class a week, whatever it is that you're able to do. And as far as the school for the deaf, that question, and avoiding the school for the deaf, I think maybe let's start with asking ourselves why we're avoiding the school for the deaf. Is it because of our own personal feelings? Or is it because we think it's not a good fit for our child? I think that answer is going to depend. The answer to that question is going to help us guide us in the right direction. But the deaf school has so much or so many resources available. Of course, we're related to the learning of ASL. There are community classes available at schools for the deaf for families to take classes and learn. And it's fun. It's fun to be in an environment where people are all learning together and they're all people like you coming together to learn. This is Mindy. I just wanted to add to what Sarah was saying. Just was going to share a little bit of my own personal experience. I am profoundly deaf. I am the only deaf person in my family. But I want you to know, in my role as a professional, I support all decisions that are made by parents about their children and making sure that those children are getting what is best for your particular family. But if I put that hat aside for this moment, my whole family is hearing, and they shared the same concerns that I'm seeing come up in this meeting. They were worried about not being able to communicate with me. They did not know American Sign Language. My parents were working full time. They were just trying to make a living. But no matter what happens, as long as you have a relationship with your child and you love your child, you will figure out how to communicate with them. It doesn't mean that you have to be fluent in American Sign Language. My father is definitely not fluent in American Sign Language, but we can still communicate with one another. And so as long as you continue engaging with your child and making connections with your child, you will figure out how to communicate with one another. But she froze.
Oh no.
That was a really good point, though, Sarah saying. I am also the only deaf person in my family. Oh, Mindy's back. I'm so sorry, I froze. The bottom line is that you need to really take a look at your child and what is best in terms of accessibility for your child so that they can have access to as much as possible. And then you will make it work and you'll be fine. As far as the School for the Deaf versus a mainstream program or going to a public school, again, you have to just look at what's best for your child. It doesn't mean that you and your family are going to be separated because your child comes to a school for the deaf. That you will always have, it just means you have a bigger family, a bigger village as part of your family. And that again is a personal family decision.
Oh, and one last thing. Again, the decisions you make are not permanent. You can always change your mind later. Maybe it's about accessing language, maybe it's about programs and services. At any time during your child's life, growing up, you can make those decisions.
This is Tracy. I have a question. I'm a teacher of the deaf in New York. I teach middle school students, 6th through 8th grade. I have one student who is in 8th grade. And since she has been a part of my program, she has always wanted to become an interpreter. In 6th grade, she had a lot of improvement in her academics and understanding, and so we decided that she could be mainstreamed at the middle school. And she did wonderfully. She's in honors now. She's in the honors program. She's going to high school, and she is still in a mainstream program. I've tried to have conversations with the parents about adding interpreter services just to provide additional support for vocabulary and complex ideas and information, reading complex text, but the parents absolutely refuse to provide an interpreter in the classroom. So now in 8th grade, she's getting ready to graduate and go to high school, and she told me, you know, I want an interpreter, but my mom won't let me have an interpreter. And I've had this discussion with the parents about this myth of not being able to, you know, that having the interpreter would make her be behind or delayed in her language. And to not develop spoken language, or the parents, though, said they did not want her to rely on an interpreter. It's just heartbreaking. So I'm trying my best to help and provide support, and she wants an interpreter. But what can I do to help the parents understand that their child is saying that they want the interpreter in order to help them and support them, because she is in honor. She's a great student. But when she goes to college and she wants to become a doctor, you know, she will need those supports, but the parents are just not willing. And so they just will not add the interpreter for her. So I don't know, my hands feel tied. What do you do in that situation?
That is so difficult.
I know. and I'm a coda. And so I've told them, I learned so many languages and I'm not deaf, but still, deaf students can learn lots of languages too.
Yeah.
So mom just will not give.
And more is better.
It is.
And I grew up in a public school myself in a mainstream setting. And I worked and I did very well in school, let me be clear, but I worked so much harder than everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got to that point where I was in high school and college and finally I had access to an interpreter, I was like, oh, th oh, this is what's everyone else doing? This is it. But that it got to that, it got so much easier for me at that point. But I think I don't know, maybe utilizing that metaphor with them, it might be helpful if someone has glasses, that kind of a thing.
Yes, yes.
And it could be like, would you withhold glasses for them because they can still see without the glasses?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
No, you wouldn't. Why? Why would you? I don't know. It might be from a different perspective that might be helpful. Or maybe another deaf person can actually walk alongside and share their experience. It is tough, I would say, with a teenager because I do know, you know, they don't really know what they need sometimes, right?
Yeah. But that student actually does know she wants the interpreter. I mean, she's been so successful without the interpreter,
Right.
but she knows it would be easier for her if she did have the interpreter.
Right. She knows what she needs, but the parents are still
Right.
making that decision and making it very difficult.
Exactly. Thank you.
I apologize.
No, it's all right. It's all right. I said, when you graduate high school and you go to college, you don't need your parents to make those decisions anymore. You'll be able to decide on your own. So she knows already when she goes to college that if she wants an interpreter, she can request one. So that's great. At least she's got
Oh, good. Just something to look forward to.
that. True, true. Thank you so much.
We had a question about how long it takes to learn ASL. Mindy did touch on that, but looks like that was our last question in the chat.
I thought to myself, when I read.
I don't know if there was if you wanted to add to that, Sarah, or if anybody else has another question.
I mean, I think it was a good answer depending on, it really depends on the person and also depends on
All right,
the
well,
environment. Because if we,
I thought to myself, you know what, I really would like a picture of that to remember these little forms. My phone was in the car. So I get back in the car and it's like, oh,
Someone,
you should really get going home.
Kylie, I'm muting you. Sorry. Or Kaylee.
no, yeah, it was another one speaking over me. Sorry. That's okay. Anyway, so yes, it is interesting about American Sign Language because it really requires your whole body. And some people who will typically think like, oh, I'm not really good at acquiring language. I'm not good at learning a new language, but because it's totally physical and visual, and it's a different modality, it really does change for a lot of people in acquiring that language. And some people it's the reverse. So they really don't know until they try. And that's coming from a deaf person. And some people can be very advanced and very quick to acquire the language quite well. So if you're learning from deaf people, it's often the fastest and the best way to really practice.
All right, thank you for that. So we're a little bit after 8, so if there's one more question, we can take it. Otherwise, I'm going to say thank you to Sarah for this presentation and for the discussion and questions. This was really great. Thank you to all of our interpreters. We really appreciate you. Thank you for everyone who has attended tonight. I can share any of the resources as well if you wanted to reach out to me. But I think that about wraps it up.
Also, I can send you some connections as well tomorrow too, if there are any other medical studies or any other things of interest that I really get into. I'll click through all of those things and send those.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yes, and I will share that with all of our participants. All right. Well, thank you again.
All right, thank you for coming. Thank you also for the interpreters. Thanks.
Thank you all so much. Have a great night. Bye-bye.
Good night.